Yo, what's up, guys? Today we're going to talk about Shadowlands' worst dungeon, Plaguefall. Basically, we're going to be talking about some of the goods and some of the bads of Plaguefall, but generally why it's going to be probably the most disliked dungeon of Shadowlands, and it's due to a large portion of the trash in this dungeon just being god-awful. So yeah, with that said, this video is basically going to be an analysis and a reasoning for why Plaguefall, I did rank it in the D tier in my tier list video from yesterday. If you like, you guys can go check that out as well. Look at where I ranked some of the other dungeons. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the video. So first, let's actually talk about what are some of the good things about this dungeon. So the first good thing is that I think it has pretty interesting bosses with unique mechanics. Dr. Ickis, the second boss in the instance, leaping from platform to platform, having to kill off the little slimes that are associated with him, and then pushing him every 33% in order to be able to jump from platform to platform, is kind of an interesting mechanic. It's a pretty nice take on that boss. The third boss in the instance, the spider boss, honestly, I think that the mechanics are kind of rough right now, especially the slow portion. But how the fight is designed, it is actually pretty engaging, and I do like how that fight is set up. Basically, you have to run over these spider webs periodically in order to be able to get out the assassins and stop the damaging dot from being applied to your group. The final boss in Plaguefall, the one where you have the tentacles that you have to dodge, is also, I think the dodging in of itself is the most interesting mechanic that we've seen from most bosses in instances. However, the slow ads that walk are kind of annoying to be able to deal with, especially for your tank. I think that maybe there should be probably some way for your tank to be able to generate threat on those slow-moving ads. Beyond that, I do think the final boss of the instance is kind of interesting because of how the tentacle mechanic ends up working out. Eventually, it will... I suspect that fight will be fairly well liked. So, those are the good things about the dungeon. The good things about the dungeon are generally just the bosses. I also think the trash in front of the last boss is quite interesting. There's 3 slow-moving packs that just sit out in front of the final boss that you end up having to kill. It's like these plague-bound, devoted guys that'll just end up walking at you. I think that those 3 packs of trash as a whole, they're kind of cool. Like, trash packs in dungeons don't exactly have to be the most engaging thing to be interesting sometimes. And these mobs there's just a lot of different mobs that you're able to just do mass amounts of AoE to. And that's pretty fun for a lot of people. So those are the good parts about the dungeons. So the bad parts about the dungeons. I think it has the absolute worst trash I've ever seen. It's just like it has 2 like separate wings of terrible trash that I just despise, and we're going to talk about it in a second. And I think it also has just a horrible layout for the dungeon with only 1 checkpoint in an astronomically large dungeon. So think it's probably the same length from beginning to end as like Shrine of the Storm, and it has like 1 checkpoint in the very middle. Again, it's an issue. You guys know how I feel about checkpoints. It's really, really annoying. In addition to that, if you take a very linear route through the dungeon, not doing any shroud skips, death skips, or anything of that sort, you will approximately be 25% trash count over. You guys know how I feel about that as well. You should not be forced to do a bunch of death skips or shroud skips in dungeons, especially of the linear variety. You should be able to take a very direct path through the dungeon, and then you should be forced to pull maybe 1 or 2 side packs in order to be able to get full trash count. That's a big X in my book if you are going to just go substantially overcount without any shenanigans. So let's talk about the first area of trash that I have a problem with. And it happens to be at the very beginning. It's the first wing of trash. Basically, there are a bunch of different types of mobs. There are the mushroom mines, which are the things that you see on the ground, the small mushrooms. The fungi stormer, who has a blade storm ability. The fungal mancer, who will drop these like roots on the ground, and he does like a healing cast. And then the decaying flesh giant, which bathes the group in goop and then spawns these big mushrooms on top of all the players. So recently, the mushroom mines respawn timer and the time to explode was nerfed pretty substantially. But even still, the area of denial in such a small and enclosed area makes this pretty rough just because of how many different ground effect abilities that you actually have to end up dodging. Like I was saying before, mushroom mines, blade storm ability, roots on the ground, decaying flesh giant with their ground effect, and decaying flesh giant with these big mushrooms. So that's a lot of different and unique area of denial ground effect abilities that you're going to have to be able to deal with. I think that this is going to be a likely candidate for a Shroud skip, just with like a standard rogue skip, because you're able to make up some of the trash in the back half of the instance, and doing this really long impeding trash at the very beginning, it only nets you about 15% of the trash that you do end up needing, just holding W and walking through. So I suspect that that's going to end up being Shrouded, but as a whole, it's really fucking annoying trash. So, moving on, we have the reason that Plaguefall will probably continue to be the worst dungeon in Shadowlands, and the reason for that is because of the third wing of trash. After Dr. Ickis, you are going to make your way up these stairs, and from there you have Tentacle City, which basically it will be death skipped unless something changes substantially about this area, because there are infinite tentacles in the middle of this area that once they are killed, they spawn these slimes that has to be soaked, like you can see on screen right here. These tentacles give about 1.66% or 10 count for what is effectively 30 seconds of combat time just by fighting the mob. Depending on dungeon level, I mean, it's going to vary a little bit. So you have to soak the slimes on top of that, so that takes some time out of it. Assuming that you get all the slimes soaked, then you don't have to deal with any of them transforming into real mobs. And you cannot do any additional trash with the slimes or with the tentacles themselves, because the tentacles are immobile. That's why these tentacles are terrible. In addition to that, there's this middle pack out in this middle of the island that is just absolutely cursed, and there's no way that you can even pull this. Blizzard continues to insist on putting packs out in dungeons where, like, I don't know what they are. They're just bait for people, where you know that if you pull them, you're just going to instantly wipe, and there's absolutely no room for recovery. So, basically, you have to play 4 of these incredibly slow tentacles that are unfun to play, give terrible count, and then you have to soak the slimes on top of them after each and every single one, and hope that you don't get these slimes out in the middle of the water to where you're actually not able to soak them, because at that point they would transform into normal slimes, giving your tank debuffs or potentially just killing your tank because of the amount of stuff that you end up having to deal with. Due to this, you're going to absolutely death skip this area 100%, no questions asked. It's very similar to how Motherlode ended up working, where that area after Azarok and Motherlode was death skipped for such an incredibly long time because the trash there was just so terrible. This is going to be the exact same for Plaguefall. Plaguefall has 2 of these areas, as a matter of fact, that are just really cursed, and you don't end up wanting to deal with it. And I think that the trash as a whole in this dungeon needs to have a look at, and they need to add a lot more checkpoints in this dungeon. In addition to that, there's absolutely no reason that you should ever be at 125 to 130% count if you take a linear path through the dungeon, not pulling any extra packs. This is, as a whole, is going to make this dungeon harder for pugs, harder for people in coordinated groups, and once you wipe, you're far more likely to end up leaving the key, because you know that your run is over because of all of the extenuating circumstances and the problems that occur with this dungeon. So just a couple things I do want to reiterate. I actually think there are a lot of bosses that are cool in this dungeon. I do think it has some interesting trash, but I think that there are some overwhelming problems that overshadow basically every part about that, and it makes this dungeon so unfun to play just from a player experience that it absolutely needs to be changed before Shadowlands comes live. So all in all, this is going to be it for today's video. I really just wanted to talk about the problems that persisted in Plaguefall and the reason that this dungeon is so heavily disliked by a lot of members of the community. If you guys have any other feedback about Plaguefall, things you like, things you dislike, just general thoughts on the dungeon as a whole, I do want to hear those down in the comments. Again, I do still think that there are a lot of good parts of this dungeon, but I think that they are grossly overshadowed by the first and the third wing of trash that definitely needs to be addressed before this dungeon is even starting to get into contention of like an okay dungeon.